Hi everyone, good morning. Thanks for coming back to Amherst on this chilly weekend. It's very breezy outside. You can hear me okay?
No.
No, you can't hear me okay. All right. Up. How's this? Is that better? Better, but not good?
Good enough.
Okay. So the first thing that I want you to do is to think about the last time that you were in an airport. And what do you remember about it? What kind of impression did it make on you? Likely you wanted to leave as soon as possible. And likely it struck you as simply a spot on a map, a nearly random collection of hard edges and noises and baffling smells. Now think about the last place that you lived on the Amherst campus, or if you didn't go to Amherst, then the last campus that you attended when you were a senior. So let those details bubble up a little bit. What were the decorations on your walls? And what could you hear down the hallway or outside your window? Maybe here the odors were also baffling, but your recollection of them is probably tinged with a different kind of feeling than those surrounding the airport smells. So what is the difference between the airport and your dorm room? Are they just two different places, just different kinds of places, made of different materials and having different functions? I don't think so. I think the airport is what I would call a space, and your dorm room is, on the other hand, a place. And the difference, I suggest, is in the sensory details and in the meaning that accrues in one place but not another. The difference is in sense of place. And that's the essential insight that I want to talk to you about today, the one that gave rise to my own love of writing and to founding the Common magazine here at Amherst and to all of the programs that we have on campus. But first we have to go back a few years to when I was a teenager and then when I was a student here at Amherst. For 3 months, when I was 17, I was the only white person in my village. When I walked home from school at the end of the day, after teaching a room full of students from an antiquated textbook, the village children would run up to me and touch my skin. They patted my hands and arms quickly and hesitantly, and then they ran away, either giggling or sometimes shrieking. And sometimes there were so many children that I was actually sort of halted in my tracks, and all I could see for several feet around me were just the tops of these shorn black heads. And then extracting myself from the throng, I would continue to meander along the red dirt path and past the maize and sugarcane fields, finally arriving home to the mud hut that I slept in under a mosquito net. I would tell my host brother, Timothy, who was also a teacher at the school, what had happened, and he would laugh. His laugh was loud and joyous and full of white teeth. We would talk about the curious children and how they just wanted to know if I was real. Maybe I was a ghost. I was definitely a stranger. They wanted to know if I felt like they felt to each other. And so who was I and why was I here? I was in Kenya teaching in the local school and living with Timothy and his mother, Mama, because I was not where I was supposed to be, which was at Amherst. I had been accepted to Amherst the previous fall, but I had deferred for a year. I was barely 17 when I graduated from high school, and my family and I thought it was a good idea if I would spend a year growing up in the real world before starting my studies. And the pairing of these two decisions, taking a year off and then attending Amherst, were the most consequential decisions of my life, as they may have been for some of you. Nearly everything that is currently important to me, that I aspire to do in my adult life, writing, reading, community building, engaging with other cultures, it is rooted in some way in the experience that I had during those 5 influential years. In Kenya, I learned how to stand in front of a classroom of students who were just my age, and wondering why our English grammar textbooks offered pages and pages of lessons on phone conversations when there wasn't a telephone or even electricity for a dozen miles. I learned how to eat live termites. I learned what passes for medical care in a rural hospital where chickens run in and out of the rooms. And I learned a great deal about what it feels like to be a stranger, to be stared at, to be confused about local customs, to be lost, how every conversation can be an adventure. In some ways, I had always felt like an outsider. I had grown up in a professional Jewish family in rural Maine. And out of 1,000 kids in my high school in the nearby city, only 4 of us were Jewish, and 3 of them were related. So my outsider identity was simply more glaringly obvious in Kenya. And sometimes I preferred it like that, being clearly different instead of subject to sidelong glances. But it was also true that in Kenya I could never pass for local, and I discovered for the first time how being a constant curiosity can be exhausting. At the same time, I possessed resources and freedom of movement and education that placed me in a clear position of privilege. And I wondered often, what should I do with these perceptions and feelings of difference, especially when accompanied by education and privilege? So when I got to Amherst, after spending a semester in Kenya and half a year in Chiapas in Mexico, which is where, if you remember, Subcomandante Marcos and his Zapatistas launched a movement for indigenous rights just a couple of years before that, I sought for some way to make sense of my experiences. I continued to study Spanish, I took every creative writing class I could get myself into, and I majored in anthropology. Because during the time that I had lived abroad, I had become filled with questions. Why are we the way we are and they are the way they are? Is it an accident of geography? What are the ingredients of culture? What happens when 2 cultures, 2 ways of knowing and seeing and understanding confront each other? What does it mean to take on habits and practices and ways of speaking of a culture that is not the one you grew up in? Cultural anthropology was exciting because it posited generalizable theories that purported to answer some of these questions. It dug into the roots of cultural practices, and through careful documentation and interviewing, a practice called ethnography, it could illuminate how those practices changed when they came into contact with other ways of doing. And this was thrilling. But over time, I realized that I was thrilled more by the act of documentation and by the specific stories that the ethnographies told than by the theories that the ethnographies gave rise to, which seemed to me too opaque and slippery to really be of much value. The trend in anthropology at that time, and I don't know if it has continued, was to recognize problematic subjectivity everywhere, to see that every photograph and every note was taken by a person with their own biases and ambitions. And while this is of course true, the resultant skepticism surrounding the claims about how people lived and why they behaved as they did just simply paralyzed me. I did not know what claims we could confidently believe, and therefore what could be gleaned from some of these generalizations. So I began to inch away from the theoretical side of anthropology. In my junior year, I spent a semester at a documentary studies center in Portland, Maine, where I learned the tools of careful and truthful observation and of accurate and compelling narrative. I was beginning to see that I was at heart 2 things, a practical person and a generalist. I would never be able to limit my interests enough to do the deep dive required by a dissertation, so a PhD was clearly out. I wanted to be out in the world with people, talking, documenting, spinning, and exchanging stories. And so my senior year, I had some successes and some failures. My failure was my senior thesis. I attempted to merge writing a documentary with theoretical analysis, and the result was an unholy mess that contained some vivid standalone scenes and conversations, but not much in the way of a cohesive whole. And then I discovered magazines. My Spanish professor, Ilan Stavins, whom some of you may know, is still here, from whom I was taking a class on Jorge Luis Borges, had founded a quarterly publication focusing on Latino culture. And the quarterly was called Hopscotch, after the book of the same title by the Mexican writer Julio Cortázar. And it contained journalism, book reviews, poems, photo essays, an assortment of riches. I applied to help out, and soon I was writing criticism and reviewing page proofs and having a pretty wonderful time. And I was discovering the key to exploiting student labor, which would come in very handy later on when I had interns of my own. And I really fell in love with magazines. I discovered they could contain ideas and visual art and creative writing, cultural commentary, pretty much something for everyone. And if you landed on an engaging theme for a magazine, you could explore a wide variety of topics through multiple genres and still provide a cohesive reading experience. So Elon promoted me to managing editor, still unpaid. And upon graduation, I secured a real job, which was working in the public affairs office here at Amherst. It was a Green Dean fellowship. And so I knew by this point that I wanted to work in publishing, and I wanted to write things. I wanted to be a part of the process by which well-written stories were sent out into the world. And I was apprenticing myself both to an art form and to a process. And I began to think how cool it would be if someday I could run my own magazine. I could help other people tell their stories beautifully, and these stories would be about places near and far, and how those places shaped us, made us both similar and different from each other. I spent a decade in this kind of apprenticeship in various gigs for magazines and publishers, large and small. I was learning how to edit, both how to make those technical copy editing marks, where the caret means insert and the little lasso on the side means delete. I visited a printing company to see how books were actually made, and I inhaled a lot of inky paper. I wrote my own short stories, and I sent them out to literary magazines. And at summer writing workshops, I realized that I had something to say about other people's stories, and that they did seem to listen when I spoke. And so I tasked myself with writing clear and constructive criticism. And then in the year that I turned 30, I did 3 things, embarked on 3 new paths. I went to grad school to earn an MFA. I started what would become my debut novel, and I launched my own magazine. But what would this magazine be about? Why would people want to read it more than they wanted to read any of the dozens of other already existing magazines that had been around for a decade or maybe even a century? So I faced both the practical problem and an existential one. In order to survive, the magazine needed a discernible focus. And this meant I had to put a label on what I was about. And I have not always been right about my interests and my abilities. When I was a sophomore at Amherst, a good friend of mine convinced me to take a philosophy class with him. He was an economics and philosophy double major, and he insisted that I did want to read some of the greats, Descartes and Leibniz and Kant, and okay, yes, I wanted to read them. And so I took the class, and I was confused the entire time. Mostly, I was frustrated by paradoxes, and I had no idea how to write an argument. I knew how to write an essay with a clear thesis and several substantiating examples, but my philosophy papers all died obscure and early deaths. But to my good fortune, the final exam was multiple choice. And so as long as I studied up on these philosophers' views, I would squeak by, which I did. But as soon as the exam was over, I bolted from the classroom and I ran straight to the library, where I emailed my parents, to whom I had been complaining the whole semester about this course, and I wrote to them, "I am done with philosophy forever." And my exclamation points took up like an entire line of the email. And my mom, who was very smart then and is very smart now, wrote back to tell me right away that forever is a very long time. And so 5 years later, I married an Amherst College philosophy professor, and I began a novel with the moral philosophy problem at its heart. So my track record concerning my own interests has really not been very accurate. And I really had to think hard on what my magazine was going to be about. I couldn't publish a whole magazine about just being from Maine, could I? But what was it that was actually important to me from being from Maine? And why did I continue to think of myself as a Mainer, even though I hadn't lived there for 15 years? And the more that I began to think about where I was from and my experiences in places like Kenya and Mexico, I thought about the singularity of those places that I had lived. The red clay earth of Kenya, the smell of fresh tortillas emanating from a storefront in San Cristobal de las Casas, the sound of my father's roosters outside my bedroom window, and the unmistakable Maine accent. These were all sensory emblems of places that meant something to me. They were locations that had become places through events that had happened to me there. And there it was. I was interested in sense of place. So it's not a new term, sense of place, but what does it actually mean? We all have physical bodies that move through geographical spaces in the world, and yet not every space is important. Think again of airports. So certainly they are locations, and we can agree that they exist in the material world, but we dismiss them as places. We call them something like nowhere land. They make no mark on us not only because we walk through them without planning to stay, but also because they do not make an impression on our senses. And in contrast, I was interested in reading stories and poems and essays in which the setting, which is just the fancy literary word for place, is meaningful, in which the place affects how people talk, the attitudes and beliefs people hold, the weather, the mood, the sense of possibility, or even foreclosure. Because everyone around the world, and therefore literary characters and narrators as well, can tell you about places that are meaningful to them. And I wanted to read about people through their places. My own experience of being an outsider in Kenya is, after all, really not so unusual. And I don't mean this just in terms of feeling like a stranger in terms of race or ethnicity. I mean that everyone first learns about the distinction between one place and another when you leave home. So when you leave the place of your earliest memories, you learn that home is one place, and that its contrast, away, is another. And this is our first lesson in geography. This is in fact what they say in my home state. If you are not from Maine, you are from away. And all those questions I was asking about cultural differences during my travels when I was 17, and that carried me through anthropology and through documentary studies into literature and publishing, those questions could be asked another way. What does place have to do with it? And I prefer the notion of place to culture because place is a little more encompassing, because it incorporates the way cultures bump up against each other, and sometimes they bounce hard like billiard balls, and sometimes they merge together like waves. And place can be as small as this podium, or that street corner, or as large as the globe. And it seemed that I had now solved the practical problem as well. Sense of place was a notion that was narrow enough that I could state concretely what the magazine would be about. But it was also broad enough that we would never run out of material or out of writers and readers interested in the topic. And so I named the magazine The Common after New England's quintessential gathering place, inspired by Amherst's own town common and by plazas and piazzas and zocolos all over the world. And so what is a literary magazine? It's a boutique enterprise, to be sure, but it is an important one, or so I like to think. Literary magazines function as the earliest gatekeepers and the talent scouts of the literary world. We nurture and publish writers at the beginning of their careers, and then we carry them along to greater visibility. We do this by publishing them alongside well-known writers. Ooh. And by carefully editing their work. At the Common, we can spend weeks or months, or sometimes upwards of a year, just working on a single piece, requesting revisions that have new research, additional scenes, stronger central themes, or revised dialogue. We read and reread, and suggest and add and trim and alter until we are exhausted, or until the piece is perfect, and we hope that those two things align. We help writers to believe in themselves and also to understand what they are trying to say. Then we publish the work with as much fanfare as possible, that is in a beautiful platform, like in a beautiful print volume or on a web page, and we spread the word far and wide. And these activities, that's really at the heart of what we do. Publishing early writers, nurturing their careers, making as much noise as possible. But as every business owner or nonprofit director knows, an entire infrastructure really is needed to do this well, to do it consistently, and on a scale that is impactful. And as it happened, I launched the Common at a time when our community spaces were rushing online and print publications were evaporating. It was 2008 and the economy was crashing. Was I delusional or just in desperate need of an interesting job? And the answer is both. And it was clear from the start that the battle to launch and sustain a new print publication was going to be uphill, and we would have to diversify and to try to reach readers and writers in multiple and very energetic ways. We would have a print volume, which would be a group of carefully selected authors in contact with each other by virtue of paginal proximity. And we would have a digital magazine accessible for free by readers all over the world. And we would bring people together in literal common space in as many ways as possible. And the first way we would bring people together is by having a very tiny office. And now, 9 years in, we also have a coffee machine. And in that tiny office, drinking coffee and eating the leftover Halloween candy and squeezing past each other on the way to the printer are a handful of extremely talented literary citizens known as Amherst College English majors. We take other majors as well, of course, for our interns, but for many students, English is at least one of their concentrations. And we get a hold of students as early as possible in their Amherst careers, and we ask them, do you know about the wonderful world of publishing? Do you know you can travel the world just by reading our submissions? Do you know that you can launch the careers of writers by recommending that a short story be published in our pages? And do you know that what you're learning in your stats class can be applied to the real-world social media problems of literary promotion? And the students who are enticed by these questions rather than annoyed become our interns, and they participate in the literary publishing internship. These are 10-hour-a-week internships during the school year and full-time in January and over the summer. In their internships in which we give students the kinds of hands-on literary opportunities that I had when I worked on Hopscotch. And the students, many of them who are burgeoning writers themselves, not only identify and discuss the most promising pieces of the slush pile, they learn how to think structurally about pieces of writing and how to see where the holes are in a piece of writing, or maybe where it goes too fast, where it makes a leap so large that a reader wouldn't be able to follow. And so in short, they're learning to edit. And editing is pretty closely related to writing in its analytical framework, but it is collaborative, and it requires entering the point of view of another creative mind. Each editor-author relationship is a cross-cultural experience. Editing requires crossing a border and living peacefully and productively with the inhabitants on the other side. And as we at the Common have gotten on in years, and will be 10 years old next year, we are constantly trying to expand our borders. After a year with my husband at NYU Abu Dhabi, where I once again relished being a stranger, the Common became a home for writers from the Middle East and from North Africa. And so we're now one of the only magazines in America that is consistently publishing Arabic voices. And our editors and our students and our readers from 199 countries around the world are thereby unusually exposed to stories from one of the most diverse and volatile regions of the world. But these pieces, we don't think of them as ethnography because they are literature. And we publish them not with the goal really of understanding another culture, but of entering another imagination. And we hope that these encounters are diverting and thought-provoking enough to spur conversations. Sometimes these conversations are with ourselves after we've read a particularly intriguing or eye-opening or challenging essay. But sometimes these conversations are public, and they focus on the moment of inspiration or the process of revision, or why it was important to an author to capture a particular kind of human experience in a particular place. And the Commons' desire to facilitate these conversations in real time, in the real world, helps spur the conversation of Amherst College Lit Fest, which I hope some of you have heard of and maybe some of you have even attended. So with the support of Biddy Martin and the administration, the Common and some other campus partners host a 3-day literary festival featuring Pulitzer Prize-winning authors and National Book Award finalists who talk candidly about their work and offer masterclasses to students. And in 4 short years, LitFest has become the sort of joyously anticipated tradition on campus in which the Writing College focuses squarely on creative expression through words. And in March, LitFest celebrates its 5th anniversary. And so I'm very proud of these literary communities that the Common has created and fostered here at Amherst that expanded upon some of the experiences that I had and really relished when I was a student. And I'm also just over the moon when we have our former interns, and there are, I think, more than 50 of them by now. They get into grad school, they land a publishing coveted job, and they publish their own first interviews and articles and poems and stories and books. In their work, I see their curiosity manifested and their desire to communicate precisely and movingly. And I see them become intrepid travelers of global and interior spaces, led by their senses and by their pens. Thank you. So I have some copies of the latest issue of the Common here, which I would be happy to talk about or answer questions of any other kind that you might have. Yeah.
I do have a question. When you're editing, and the reason I'm asking is because I'm just doing some writing myself and working with an editor, and I don't have any sense of what editors do. So my question is, although I know it's not for me.
Right.
But anyway, my question is, if you are editing a short story, let's say, do you actually go so far as to recommend like changes in wording, like take out this word or put in another word? So you're actually recommending a change to the author's prose. You know, maybe this paragraph is superfluous, or this one needs more, elaboration.
Right.
To what level of detail do you go as an editor?
Well, I think the first responsibility of an editor is to communicate to the author what's coming across in a piece. So if someone submits me a manuscript, the first thing that is sort of my responsibility is to say, this is how I'm reading it, to give a kind of clear articulation of what's coming across, what are the themes that are coming across, but then also to say, this is where I'm confused, this is where I think it's not reading very clearly. And then we would probably talk about the structure of a piece. Where does it need more material? And I think this theme would come through a little bit more clearly if I had some additional material, if I had some more background. And so that kind of conversation is sort of the first level of conversation. But then, yeah, absolutely. There is, I don't think this paragraph is helping us, so I think we should take that paragraph out. Here's a phrase that sort of gets at what I'm suggesting. So I think you need a transition sentence here. Here's the kind of sentence that I would imagine. I might suggest something in my own words, which the author should change to their own words if they want to. So yeah, I think it encompasses all levels, from like very big picture conversations down to let's try this word instead of that word. And there are lots of different styles among editors too. Some people excel at the macro level or the micro level. But I would say, all editors should probably be versed in the range of things. Yeah. Yeah.
What makes your publication unique, if it is? And if it isn't, are there any similar publications?
Well, I do think that what makes it unique is this focus on sense of place. That while there are other magazines that are interested in the environment, or maybe the built environment, things like architecture, the way we articulate sense of place and what we're looking for in terms of how place affects how people talk to each other, or what happens in a story, or the mood, or some kind of atmosphere. So that is unique. And the other thing that there are other magazines that are nicely designed, but honestly, ours is particularly beautiful. It feels nice. You touch the cover; it's very soft. We have French flaps. Like it's a very, we really care about creating like an enduring print object. Something that it will be beautiful in the world. But I would say it's sort of those two things, and then that's what's visible to the reader. But then the attention that we give to authors in terms of the effort that we put into editing and working with authors is also somewhat distinctive. Certainly there are some other magazines that do that, but it's a small group. Yeah.
Could you tell us about your book?
About my book? Yeah. So my book takes place in Kenya, which was a lot of fun for me to write, and it's actually about an Indian family, sort of multiple generations that migrated from India to East Africa, to Kenya in particular, to Nairobi, and then to the States. And this represents sort of a large but not very well-known migration pattern of Southeast Asians. And so then it's sort of a family drama where one of the narrators learns a family secret within the first chapter, and then this provokes a family reunion and a philosophical crisis. So, but, yeah. I don't know if that was enough, but yeah.
So you've been doing this publication for 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm just wondering whether over that time you've noticed or perhaps cultivated different ways of writing about or thinking about or experiencing sense of place.
Yeah, I think that's one of the exciting things about running a magazine is that you're constantly encountering other people's ideas of how to write a story in the first place, but how to write about a particular place. And so we have one author who published a couple of issues ago, and he submitted another story that we like, and it's sort of takes place in sort of somewhat modern day Turkey, but it has some fantastical elements too. And I never would have thought that mix would be something that I was interested in, or that elements that are made up could tell you more about a particular place. And so I do find the way that he does it, sort of combining real world elements with some more exaggerated or fantastical elements, is quite effective in creating a sense of place. And I'm not sure that, I've never done that in my own writing. I'm not sure that I would have come up with that. But I think I also, you become so attuned to individual words or particular phrases that you see how much even just a small phrase can conjure a place. I have a writer who's writing about a rock band right now, and he's sort of writing about the sense of place in song lyrics. And songs are so short, but his argument is that a real sense of place is being created in just a couple of lines, and it's convincing. So, yeah.
Does any of the writing have anything to do with Amherst College?
Sometimes. Our student interns have written pieces over the summer, so we work with them over the summer so we can publish some of their work, and sometimes they write about their Amherst experiences. I would say not a whole lot otherwise, but sometimes, Amherst the town is sometimes mentioned, but then I would say the college is probably just referred to if there's an alum who were publishing, but so sometimes, yeah.
Can you give us more of a sense of where you draw your authors from? What is that population?
So we have submissions from all over the world, and I'm not always sure how people find us, but since we've been publishing Arabic literature, from the Arab world, we have been making more inroads among authors there, and so then sometimes the word is spread through social media, often through Facebook and Twitter, and people learn about the magazine that way. So we do, in recent years, we have done more of these special portfolios in the issues where we're focusing on a particular country or a particular region. So last fall, we published our portfolio of writers from Puerto Rico to mark 1 year after Hurricane Maria. So that was an example of like very much soliciting work. So I went to San Juan and I read a bunch of work that people had recently published, and then I contacted them, and then we worked on translating the work. So sometimes it's very directed and sort of solicited like that, or my co-editor who I work with on the Arabic fiction portfolios, he lives in Jordan, so he then knows some writers and in Syria and in Jordan and in other places. So we work like multiple ways to try to find new writers. We try to connect with writers' organizations and let them know about opportunities that we have. We bring the common to book fairs and to book festivals in Boston and in Brooklyn, and so then we get to talk to people sort of face to face. So it's all like from top to bottom, it's a lot of different kinds of outreach. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah, I just wanted to see if there was anyone who hadn't asked a question yet, but go ahead.
If I understand correctly, the magazine is published in English
Mm-hmm.
only, but do you get submissions in other languages that you translate and publish in the magazine?
Sometimes we publish bilingual pieces. We mostly do that online for space considerations, but sometimes in the print issue, we had some Spanish language poems that we have done bilingually. In terms of getting submissions in other languages, we do get works in translation that are being submitted, and we encourage that and try to publish as much works from other languages as possible, but they're submitted in English sometimes with the original language accompanying it, because we don't really have people on staff who are fluent in a lot of languages. And we work with the translators once they have already rendered the piece into English. But, yeah. Did you have another question or no?
Do you get financial support from the college other than the work of the interns, the students?
Yeah, we do. So it has been sort of a process of gradual integration over the years. So when we first started, we had some fairly minimal support, and then over the years we've gotten more support, and now we have 2 staff positions that are dedicated to the magazine, which is significant, as well as the funding to publish the magazine. So we have Amherst College support, but we also have a standalone nonprofit organization so that we can apply for grants from other organizations that only support nonprofits, and we do our own fundraising to bring funds in from them. So it's sort of a joint effort between the two. Yeah. Sure.
Your interns, what do they do? What do they
Yeah.
do after they leave Amherst?
I mean, what do they do when they're interns, and then what do they do, when they graduate? So our interns really do a lot. Like they are really a substantial aspect of the magazine. So they read submissions, which is usually what they're most excited about. And then, of course, we talk about those submissions. We have editorial conversations, and sometimes they will engage with authors and do some editing with authors, sort of depending on how long they've been with the magazine and what level of expertise they have acquired. They also they do some event planning. They represent the magazine at book fairs. They do a lot of graphic design work. They do some social media work, and that reference in the talk to the stats class was an example. Like one of my students took a stats class, and he decided he wanted to apply it to how successful our social media promotion was. So what could he glean about our Google Analytics from page views and from our promotion efforts. And so students are in a lot of ways often surprising us with the things that they bring or the things that they want to do. And so then when they graduate, they sometimes they want to be writers, so they'll go to, get an MFA. Sometimes they are interested in PhD programs in English literature or in other areas. They might work in publishing or some other kind of nonprofit, or work in development at a nonprofit. So they do a pretty wide variety of things, largely in the humanities or the arts. But yeah.
Design, these students?
No, it's not. They do a lot of graphic design for us, but the covers are done by someone I used to work with in book publishing, who is a graphic designer. And so, yeah, she always, our covers are always different colors and different common objects on the cover. But
The approach to geography had, in high school, I retired about 10 years ago, but I think for 10 years, the focus on how to teach geography was place. And all of the aspects of that created a culture.
yeah, I think it has changed a lot in recent years, and there is a lot more attention to place, and some people are asking, is place destiny, because they're looking at how influential a particular place is in terms of educational achievement, but also things like income and health and all kinds of things. So yeah, so it is a really interesting field. Like if I did, if I had all the skills to get a PhD, it might be in geography now, because it is so interesting the way it's the intersection of all those fields. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, you guys.